Hi everyone, Mr. Boltri here, bringing you a video in which we are going to be introducing the vocabulary that we're going to be using in Unit 2. So to get us started, we're going to look at two words that are pretty similar but have a very important difference, and that's clock reading and time interval. So the difference between clock reading and a time interval is a clock reading is if you just look at the clock and you read the time right off the clock. It is whatever time it is at a given specific moment. And then a time interval is how long it is between two different clock readings. So for example, right now, if I look at the clock, it's 3:20 p.m. That is the clock reading from right now. It is the time right now. And a time interval is the time between two different clock readings. So if I look at the clock at 12:35 and then look at it again at 12:55, the time interval between those two has been 20 minutes. So that's kind of the difference between these two very similar words. And you'll notice that on these slides, in this unit, there are a lot of similar terms that we need to make sure that we're keeping track of the differences between those. Another example of similar terms are position, distance, and displacement. So much like a clock reading, a position is where you are at a given moment, whereas distance is kind of how far total that you've traveled, and displacement is a specific word for how far you are away from where you started. So some examples is you might need to give your position. Let's say you get a call from your parent and they say, "Where are you right now?" You have to say, "Well, I am exactly at this place. I am at my friend's house." And so then they know your exact position at a specific clock reading or a specific time. So distance is the total distance traveled. So one classic example of distance is if you wear a Fitbit. It keeps track of your distance, the distance you traveled over the course of a day in like number of steps. So it doesn't care if you're walking up the stairs or down the stairs, if you're walking east, south, north, west, it just cares how many steps that you're walking. So it's kind of the total distance that you traveled, and we just call that distance. And for displacement, let's look at an example that we're going to do right now. Okay, so I'm sitting here in my chair, and if I go on a journey, we're going to look at where I am at the beginning and where I'm at the end. Are you ready? Okay, start. Stop. So in that, obviously, I moved some distance. My distance traveled would be some number, let's call it 20 steps. But my displacement, if we look at how far I am from where I started here, I ended here, so my displacement is 0. You could imagine that if instead of watching me run around the table, you just looked at me at the beginning, then closed your eyes and looked at me at the end. The only two things that we care about are where I was at the beginning and where I was at the end. And since I'm in the same place, my displacement is 0. Whew. So now let's look at two terms that we use a lot, especially in physics, the difference between a scalar and a vector. So a scalar is something where we're measuring a quantity, like how much of something. And a vector is something where we're measuring a quantity and a direction. So for example, something that's a quantity would be like temperature, is we just measure how many degrees. It's 32 degrees outside. Sounds pretty cold. But for a vector, we need a quantity and a direction. So for example, if somebody said, "Well, how do I get to the store from here?" You wouldn't just say, "Oh, well, yeah, you go a mile." That wouldn't be very useful. You'd have to say, "Well, you have to go a mile to the east." So that's kind of the difference between a scalar, which does not have direction, it's just a magnitude. You could just say like number of Skittles in the jar. That is just a magnitude, is just how many, the quantity. Whereas a vector has a magnitude, 1 mile, and a direction to the east. So one of the classic examples of the difference between a scalar and a vector is going to be the difference between speed and velocity. And you can remember it because speed starts with an S, like a scalar, and velocity starts with a V, like a vector. Because speed is how fast you're going, and we don't care about direction when we're talking about speed, which is what makes it a scalar. And for velocity, it's basically the speed, how fast you're going, plus a direction, which is what makes it a vector, because we do care about the direction. So for the speed, you might say, "Oh, well, I'm going 50 miles an hour, 50 miles per 1 hour. And for the velocity, you might say 45 miles per hour headed south on I-75. So the south here is the difference in what makes this a velocity, because it's a vector because it has the direction. And so those are just some of the major terms that we're going to be using in Unit 2. So make sure that when you are talking about position, you use the word position and you don't accidentally use the word distance or displacement. So just try to be as particular as you can with the words that you use because they are different and the differences do matter. So I'm looking forward to exploring these vocabulary words and the rest of Unit 2 starting in our next class. But for now, this is Mr. Boltri wrapping up video 2.1, and go Bears.